Hi, everybody. Peggy McGuire here, coming to you with English 104, technical writing. And this week's topic is going to be technical definitions. What do you mean by that? We're going to be looking at specific kinds of definitions, and let's jump right in and talk about what kinds of definitions we're talking about here. So, technical definitions are used when there are specialized terms or concepts that you may be familiar with, but that your audience may not be familiar with because they don't have your level of expertise in a particular field. Be that the nursing field, be that computer information systems, whatever specialized field we're talking about. You are the expert. You are familiar with the words, with the concepts. You're addressing an audience who may not be familiar because they don't have your level of expertise. That's when we use technical definitions. Therefore, when you write such a definition, you must be precise in your language, remembering that the people you're addressing don't have your level of expertise or familiarity in that particular field. You want to use clear, plain, basic, direct English to define your terms and your concepts. In other words, you're going to tell your audience what exactly this thing is if you are defining a thing. What makes it what it is? What makes it different from everything else? Or if you're defining a concept or a process, what exactly does it involve? And how does it affect me? All right? Those are the kinds of things you're trying to communicate in clear, plain, direct English. Why is this important? Why is it important to be able to write this kind of definition? First of all, whenever you're communicating about an issue or on some topic that you want people to learn from you about, you're going to be creating a document, and you want that document overall to make sense to your reader. Otherwise, why are you bothering? So you want to write in a way that your reader is most likely to understand, right? And again, especially if your reader is not at a high level of expertise as you are in whatever the field or concern is. So, in general, in the world, the public needs clear and accurate information in order to be able to understand things, and then in order to be able to make decisions based on their understanding, based on their evaluation. We want readers to be able to make good decisions, just as we want people in general to be able to make good decisions. And it is generally true that we make better decisions when we know more, when we have clear, accurate information, when we are able to understand an issue well enough to evaluate how we stand on it, and then to make decisions based on that evaluation. So our job as writers is to help readers understand that at that level. To do that, we're going to need to use definitions in technical materials. All right? So that's the piece about just generally helping readers understand. But there are other overarching issues whenever we create documents for the public. And that is, first of all, the creator is legally responsible for that document once it is published. Either the writer herself or the organization that you represent is legally responsible. Therefore, you want to make sure that the words you're using are accurate, are that what you're saying is factual, that you are not misleading, either deliberately or by accident. Well, the best way to reach that level of clarity and accuracy is to define your terms. and define them clearly so that the reader understands. Linked to that legal responsibility is also an ethical responsibility. You, as the writer, the organization you represent, are ethically responsible for communicating accurate interpretations of the facts as you understand them. And again, how do we interpret facts as accurately and fairly as possible? Part of that is by making sure that all the words are clear. Therefore, we define terms so that it's more likely that we are creating an accurate representation of the facts. All right. So these technical definitions get really important in terms of the overall impact of the message you're trying to send. Therefore, what do we think about when we are starting to write a technical definition? We start with audience. We think about who we are writing to. And as I said, often when you're using technical definitions, you are writing to an audience who has less expertise in the field that you're concerned with than you do. But that's what you have to make sure you know. Who am I writing this to? Am I writing it to the general public, who I can assume do not have as much familiarity as I do with the field of interest here? Or there could be times when it's actually the opposite is true, and you're actually writing to other experts in the field of interest. If that's the case, your writing is going to look very different, and your level of need to define terms is going to be very different, because you're already assuming a good deal of knowledge on the part of people who are as familiar or maybe even more familiar than you are with the issue. So, first thing I think about, who am I writing to and how much do they already know about this issue? Because that's going to drive how dense and how complicated and how lengthy my definitions are going to need to be. Okay? And that takes me to the second, always the linked consideration, purpose. What is it that my audience needs to know, and why does my audience need to know it? Why does my audience need to know what this word means? Why does my audience need to know what this concept involves? Okay, why? Why? What am I trying to accomplish here? What do they want to know? What do they need to know? All right. Now, when you actually start then writing based on your thinking about your audience and your purpose, you always, always, always define the terms the first time you use them. Never use a term that you think the readers are not going to be familiar with without defining it immediately the first time. So, unless you're absolutely sure that the readers will already understand them. If it's a term or a concept that is in such general use, such general familiarity that you feel like you can get away with just using it, fine. But you have to make that decision. And as soon as you come to a term that you believe your audience may not be familiar with, define it immediately. All right? Don't wait until later, because if you do, you will confuse and then lose your reader. All right, so let's look at 3 types of technical definitions. We're going to look at all 3, but we're going to spend most of our time on the third, as you'll see in a minute. So let's talk about the first kind of technical definition that you're most likely to use in any document that is of a technical nature. And we call these parenthetical definitions. In other words, definitions inside of parentheses. And what those definitions are is either a synonym, a word that means the same thing as the word you're defining, or a clarifying phrase, some statement about that word that defines it. And that parenthetical definition comes directly after the term being defined. All right? Very important. So you're using parentheses around your definition, which will be either a word or a short phrase, and that those parentheses come directly after you use the term. So let's look at an example here. The trees scheduled to be taken down are mostly deciduous. Parentheses. Phrase that defines deciduous. Parentheses. See how that works? Excuse me. Alright? So that's what we mean by parenthetical. In parentheses, comes directly after the word we want to define, and is either one word or a brief phrase that defines that word. Alright? The second type of technical definition that you're most likely to be using in a technical document will be longer than parenthetical. It'll be sentence length. It's going to be more elaborate of a definition than what you can put in parentheses, or that you want to put in parentheses. These kinds of longer, more elaborate definitions within a sentence are especially good if you're going to be using the term often within your document, and you don't want to have to keep repeating what it means throughout the document. Right? That is a waste of time and a waste of ink or computer space. So you don't want to worry about having to over and over again say what a word means. So you give it one good sentence in the beginning to define it, and then you don't have to define it any longer. So let's look at a formula for a sentence definition. The formula begins with whatever term you're defining. The next word is a verb. Is. Something is. The next thing is a statement of the broad class of things to which that term belongs. And then the last part of the sentence is where you tell me how that thing is different from other members of that broad class. We're going to look at an example of this in a minute, but let's just go over that again. So you start with your term or your concept. Is. Then you state the broad class of things to which that term or concept belongs. And then you finish by explaining how your term or concept is different from other members of that broad class. That's our formula for a sentence type definition. Alright, so here we look at the formula again for a minute. And now let's look at an example. So let's take diabetes. That's our concept, that's our term. So we start with the term being defined, diabetes, is, and now we talk about a broad class of things to which that term belongs. So the broad class here is metabolic disease. Right? Diabetes belongs with all other metabolic diseases in that group. All right? You could actually get even more general, and you could say diabetes is a disease. But that's a very big, broad group to which diabetes belongs. So here, we're trying to be a little more specific, but we're still talking about a broad category. Metabolic diseases. Right? So, our formula, diabetes is a metabolic disease. And then what comes next, remember, is how diabetes is different from the other members of this class called metabolic diseases. So what makes diabetes unique in this definition? And that is that it is a metabolic disease specifically caused by a disorder of the pituitary gland or pancreas. Alright? So, one more time, look at the formula. The term is part of a class, but that has something about it that makes it different from all other members of that class. That's how you construct a sentence definition. All right? Look at that just one more moment. Make sure you get it. That's what a sentence definition should look like. All right? Okay, now, the third type of definition we're going to look at is we're going to spend a little more time with, and that is an expanded definition. An expanded definition is a longer and more detailed definition that we would be writing if we assume and know, hopefully, that our audience needs a lot more information from us in order to understand the term or the concept we're defining. So if we've already established that the audience is not as familiar as we are, that they're going to need a lot more support, then we're going to probably be using expanded definitions. Okay? And by expanded, we could mean a paragraph to several pages. Some entire documents do nothing but define a term or a concept. All right? So it could be a whole paper, or it could be a paragraph. And how long it is going to help you answer the next question, is where you put it. Okay? When you use an expanded definition, you're going to either be putting it near the beginning of a long document, because you're going to have to get that out early on in order for your reader to understand the rest of what you say. So it's either going to be at the very beginning of a long document, or you're going to decide that it needs to be a separate connected document, which we call an appendix. All right? So if it is long and involved, but you feel like including it in the document itself may get in the way of the reader's understanding rather than clarify, then what you say is, we're going to make this a separate document and we're going to connect it to our original document as an appendix. All right? Now, we have lots of different strategies, what we call expansion strategies, for expanded definitions. All right? And you are going to be working with a number of these in your assignment for this week. You're going to get to choose which ones make most sense for you to use, because the choosing strategies really depends to a large extent on what it is you're trying to define, whether it's a term or a concept, a thing, a process. It's really going to, what it is you're defining is going to help you decide what expansion strategies to use. So let's look at these strategies. First of all, if it's a term that you're trying to define, then one way to define it is by talking about its etymology. In other words, where did the word come from? What did it mean when we first started using it? Has its meaning changed over time? If so, what were those changes? When did they happen? Why did they happen? All right, so you really go deep in a definition of the term's origin. Okay? If it's a thing or a process, you can talk about its history, how something was invented, or how it was developed. All right? Back to terms. One way of defining a term is by telling us not what it means, but what it does not mean. And that can be a very powerful way to define a term. Let's start by saying what this is not. And then you define what it is not. Sometimes when that's a most powerful strategy is when there is controversy about whatever it is you're defining, I think. Or if you believe that there's lack of understanding out there or misunderstanding of the concept or the term you're defining, this could be especially powerful because you want to clear things up right at the beginning by saying what this is not. Then you can go on and say what it is. So that's an especially powerful strategy for more controversial or misunderstood concepts. Another expansion strategy is by talking about a thing's operating principles. In other words, how something works. If it's a complex machine that produces something, you tell me how it works. Or another thing you can do with a complex piece of machinery or a piece of furniture, I don't know, a medical device, is by analyzing it, by listing and defining each of its parts. When we use that term analysis, we're always talking about breaking things down into parts. So, an analysis here would be listing and defining each of the parts of something as a way to define it. Okay? More expansion strategies. Taking the visual approach. What does something look like? Actually describing what it looks like. Comparison contrast. How is it either similar to or different from other things? So, if we go back to our example about diabetes, and we said diabetes is one of a member of a group of metabolic diseases, but is caused by specific issues, then we could, to further explain that, we could talk about how diabetes is similar to other diseases in its class, but is also different from them. You could, so just use a good comparison contrast strategy. If you're defining something, or something, you could talk about conditions required for its use. In other words, do you need any special materials? Or do you need to handle this thing in any particular way? Are there restrictions on how you should be using this? All right. Examples. A great way to define is by giving your reader a real-life illustration of how something is used or applied. And then finally, and very popular, frequently asked questions. Think about your audience. This really requires you to think about your audience. And think about, what is my audience most likely to be confused by? What is my audience most likely to wonder about? What is my audience most likely to ask questions about? And then I write down those questions and I answer them in a nice, user-friendly, conversational way, so that I'm sort of cutting off the possibility of confusion before it even arrives. Okay? So, you're ready to write your technical definition. How do you do it? First of all, again, know your audience. How technically savvy is your audience in this particular field? Are they technically savvy? Are they semi-technical? Or are they a non-technical audience? Do you assume that they know almost nothing about the field that you're addressing? And then you tailor the level to your intended readers. Alright? So you're thinking about, at the beginning, you're thinking about audience and therefore word choice and tone and approach. And then you basically write a good essay. And a good essay in this context means each paragraph is developed around the main idea and is logically connected to the other paragraphs. There's a logical flow in the overall paper. But you're still using paragraphs the way you do in any good essay, which is to develop one main idea. And then you logically connect those paragraphs together so that you've got, your reader can follow you clearly and without question through your information. Okay? And that's the second bullet. That overall, when you have those good paragraphs connected logically, overall it feels like this is a unified and coherent statement about something that I didn't know before. Alright? And, as you've done before, if it's appropriate, and it probably is usually necessary, have your visuals in there in the right places to help your reader understand the text. All right? And let's finish just by talking about a few other ways that you can put technical definitions into a document. First of all, if you have a lot of words being defined, a lot of terms, a lot of concepts, because you really believe your audience needs that level of support to understand what you're writing. And rule of thumb is more than 5. If you've got more than 5 terms or concepts that you are defining, then what you want to do is create a glossary. A glossary is an alphabetically ordered list of definitions, right? Starting with A and going through Z. So, yeah, and basically just like a dictionary, all right? And you create this document, and within your essay, you tell the reader where the glossary is. Is it in an appendix? Is it at the end of the text? Does it precede your document text? You have to tell the reader where to find the glossary. Okay? So that's one way of dealing with it. If you have just a couple of terms, just a few concepts, those can be put into what we call working definitions. And working definitions are actually defined in the introduction to your essay. All right? So you come right out and say, okay, we're going to be using a couple of terms pretty often in this essay, so we want you to know right up front what they mean. Here are our working definitions for these terms, for these concepts. Okay? And finally, you can use footnote definitions. You can actually, put the number at the place where you need to define the term, where you use the term. You can say there's a footnote, and down in the footnote you define the term. So that's another way. Again, you don't want to use that too often, but it is another option for getting your technical definitions in there. Okay? So, good luck with your own team's technical definitions. Take care.